Father Dubay opens chapter 11 with the following quote: "What is called the high standard of living consists, in considerable measure, in arrangements for avoiding muscular energy, for increasing sensual pleasure, and enhancing caloric intake above any conceivable nutritional requirement." And he goes on to say that we're so often pursuing things that are unnecessary. We eat when we're not hungry, we rest when we're not weary, we speak when there's no need to speak, we buy clothes when our current clothes are not worn out, we ride when it would be better to walk. Because in an affluent society like ours, even if theoretically we resist the dominant framework of that society, we're going to be shaped by it nonetheless. And in the last chapter, Father Dubay said that the minimum level of voluntary poverty consists in rejecting anything that's superfluous and only keeping what is necessary. But that means we need to define what is necessary, what a necessity is, because people will violently disagree. As he says, someone might say that their wardrobe of 100 outfits is necessary. And the only way we can actually figure out what is truly necessary is by looking at the distinction between ends and means. Ends are things that are good in and of themselves. And for us, God is the ultimate end. Whereas means are only good to attain ends. So, for instance, teaching is a means to acquiring knowledge. Food is a means to maintaining health. Once we understand that distinction between means and ends, we can see that something is superfluous if it's not needed either as an end or as a means. So, food is obviously not an end, it's a means, and therefore any food over what is necessary for maintaining health is superfluous. If we're overeating, in fact, we'll be damaging our health and not attaining the end that we are seeking to use the means for. And for Christians, since our final end is beatitude in heaven, we can only tell what is superfluous by looking towards this final end. What do we need along the way to heaven? Because the great temptation of this life is to turn aside and pursue means as if they were ends. We tend to eat for the sake of eating, dress not for warmth or modesty, but for our own vanity, seek excitement and interest to counteract our own boredom. And of course, in the modern world, this is even more difficult. We're constantly being presented with 1,000 unnecessary things to chase after because we have an economy that needs to grow to survive. Every generation, we need to have twice as many things to purchase and amuse ourselves with just to keep our economy running. It's always been a challenge for the Christian to avoid being distracted by what's superfluous, but it's especially difficult in today's world. Even once we have two people who are really seeking God as the final end, there still might be disagreements of what is necessary simply because that word needs to be defined a little further. So Father Dubay lays out the fact that there are different kinds of necessary things. In fact, there's 4 basic categories of necessities. He says that there's the basic survival needs of food and water and basic shelter, and everyone agrees that those are needs. But beyond survival needs, there's also health needs, because we aren't just aiming at survival. We need enough food and enough of the right kinds of food to be healthy. We need a certain amount of rest and relaxation and recreation. We need a certain amount of exercise, all these things to be physically and mentally and spiritually healthy. And then, because we're not just physical beings, we have spiritual needs. We have to have worship needs. We need a certain level of instruction. And finally, we have functional needs. Since we have various jobs and roles to carry out in society, we will need various tools to fulfill those roles and tasks. And of course, sometimes, as was discussed in earlier chapters, we might be called on to give up lesser needs for the sake of greater needs for others. Father Dubay explains that even in this life, pursuing what is superfluous brings its own punishment. Those who focus on means rather than on ends become spiritually blind and dull of heart, and they lose the joy of prayer and contemplation and the joy of being able to help their neighbor. They lose the delight in the Lord that should be our strength and are tormented by inner worries about all these unnecessary things. But by striving to follow the one thing that is necessary, we can put all of our other needs and desires in the proper perspective. Father Dubay concludes the chapter by pointing out again that it can be difficult, even if we're really trying to follow the Lord, to figure out what is necessary and what is superfluous. And he says that we need discernment in this, and a spiritual director can certainly be useful, but he also provides us with a little examination of conscience, a set of questions that can help us to consider this question of necessity, which I will be including in the notes for this lesson. In the next few chapters, Father Dubé will apply the teaching on voluntary poverty to particular states in life.